You are listening to Redefining Disability, an adaptive sports podcast brought to you by Move United. I am your host, Shuan, and I have the privilege of serving as the editor of Move United magazine, the nation's leading adaptive sports publication. Each week, tune in to hear how sports have made it possible for our nation's adaptive athletes, training tips from the best coaches and program leaders, and news on the latest technology, equipment, and trends in the industry. Keith Gabel was introduced to snowboarding in 2000, and he quickly developed a love for the sport. In June 2005, he was involved in an industrial accident that crushed his left foot, ultimately leading to amputation. 3 months later, he was back on the board. Now he's a 3-time Paralympian and 2-time Paralympic medalist. Let's chat with him. So, Keith, I think for those listening, I'd love for us to just start by telling the audience a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So, name's Keith Gabel. I am a below-the-knee amputee. Lost my leg in 2005 due to an industrial accident. Had over 2,000 pounds worth of hydraulic pressure, crushed my foot for over 15 minutes. I was stuck in a machine. Following 4 blood transfusions, 3 of which I completely bled to death, if you will. Lost a lot of time and circulation. So following those 4 blood transfusions, was gone for over 3 minutes the third time. Ended up with a pulmonary embolism, tried to pass to my heart, and lost circulation to my foot and had to have my leg amputated below the knee. From there, snowboarding has always been my passion. Let me just back up. Before we actually decided to amputate, I was in the doctor's office and we were trying to make a decision between partial limb salvage or just kind of skipping to amputation. And I don't know why, but my first question to the doctors was, how long till I can snowboard again? And they gave me some pretty rough odds with the partial limb salvage. If ever, 5 to 10 years, something like that. And in my head, all I was hearing was if ever, right? And so I said, it sounds like those surgeries aren't even going to work. We're not going to know for about 2 years down the road if they have worked. What if we just cut to the chase and amputate? How long till I can snowboard then? And the doctors kind of looked at me funny and they're like, well, technology's good. You're a healthy guy, got a great attitude. We could see you living a normal life with a prosthesis. 3 years. I said, okay, well, it's July now, opening day's in October. How about 3 months? And they said, man, whatever's going to make you make the right decision. And so I said, in my head, Dumb and Dumber style, I'm just hearing, so you're saying there's a chance. And so I said, all right, if you think it's possible, let's just cut to the chase. And, fast forward to where I am today. I've had an amazing career in para snowboarding, as part of the original 17 that competed at the first ever sanctioned World Cup in Auxerre, France in like 2010 or something like that. And I'm still doing it to this day. Won 61 World Cup medals, 3-time Paralympian, 2-time medalist, 2-time X Games gold medalist. What else? I was flag bearer in 2022 at the Beijing Paralympic Games. And I, with all of that being said, I'm not trying to brag, I'm just trying to kind of help people understand that, medals to me aren't everything. I still consider October 31st, 2005, one of my all-time greatest, if not my greatest accomplishments in snowboarding, was just getting back on my snowboard and allowing myself that recovery through sport.
Yeah. So October 31st, 2005.
Yeah, that's the one.
Yeah, that's awesome. And so for those that don't know, we'll dive a little bit deeper, obviously, into the sport itself. So you obviously were passionate about snowboarding beforehand. And so what is the difference between, what you knew before your accident and how you snowboard now?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't think too many people have really asked me that specific question. I would say one of the biggest differences about what I knew was my limitations. beforehand, so I grew up skiing and snowboarding. I started on skis when I was like 12 and then switched to snowboarding when I was like 15. And then this accident happened. My amputation was exactly 1 week before my 21st birthday. And I wouldn't say I was like limitless in snowboarding. I put a lot of limits on myself prior to my injury. And after kind of walking through to the other side and coming back, I think a lot of that fear had kind of gone away of injury. I sustained the gnarliest injury, and I was relatively, I wouldn't say I was like reckless or safe on a snowboard. I would just say like I stayed within my limits for the most part, and I didn't push them to the absolute limit prior to my injury. And up until that point, I mean, I was relatively healthy my whole life, very minimal injuries and stuff. I had concussions and stuff like that and some broken bones here and there, but nothing super, super traumatic, right? And then, of course, I always say, like, I was slowly but surely filling up that cup. And then one big injury that changed my life forever. But once it did, I had a lot of friends point this out to me. They're like, dude, you're nuts. Like you do things on a snowboard now as an amputee. It's probably 2 years after my amputation, 3 years after my amputation. They're like, you're doing stuff that, one, none of us want to do, and two, you never would have tried before. And so I think it was my limits, the limits that I knew prior to my injury were much, the gap wasn't nearly as big as
Mm-hmm.
it was post injury. Post injury, I was just like, well, I've already died, missing a limb. What's the worst that can happen, and I would say that would probably be it. Yeah.
So you kind of let go, basically, right?
Yeah, in a lot of ways. And I think in a lot of ways, it really opened my world to another aspect of snowboarding, bigger cliff drops, bigger jumps, the fear of something can go wrong kind of got put in the back of my head. And, I would say I was a decent snowboarder prior to my injury. A lot of friends said, dude, you've gotten so much better. Um, and I don't know if it was just because I was thinking of the movements that much more because I had to be so focused on what I was trying to get my hip and knee to do, because
Mm.
now I'm missing, the lower portion of my leg. There's no ankle articulation. So you really had to focus on what you were trying to get the board to do through different parts of the body. I really don't know, but I think maybe that had a little bit to do with it.
Yeah, and I know you've been a big advocate in getting other people into the sport and supportive of whether it's at the Hartford Ski Spectacular or other events. But um, what what do you think in terms of how the sport has become more accessible, or just in general the accessibility of the sport to more people with disabilities?
Well, I think my first thought initially is it could always be more accessible than it is even right now. I think that it has grown exponentially in the last 10 years, but I think it still has a lot of room to grow. It's an expensive sport. It's not easy to get into. If you don't live by the mountains, then you've got to travel to them. That could either be fuel costs or flights. Mountain towns by nature are very expensive because they are tourist towns. So then you're looking at, say, lodging or rent. You're looking at food costs. You're looking at lift tickets. You're looking at a lot of things that really put some massive limits on what people are capable of. But I do think that with the growth of Paralympic snowboarding, or para snowboarding as we call it these days, I would say there's a lot of programs out there that are really looking to help people. You've got the National Ability Center out of Park City. You've got the National Sports Center for the disabled out of Winter Park. You have Steamboat Stars. You've got the BOEC, who we're going to be doing some work with in a few weeks a few weeks. I'm not sure when this is actually going to air, but in December, BOEC has a big presence at Ski Spectacular. And I think organizations like Move United and the stuff on the East Coast, I think there's a lot of people really interested in helping gain more traction. I would say Paralympics showcasing it on TV, making it possible for the rest of the world to see it's no longer just a bunch of ragtag snowboarders running their mouth and telling anybody with a set of ears what they're trying to do. It's a global thing. And I think
Hmm.
with that, comes the opportunity for big, big numbers, but also big responsibility to continue to push for everybody to become inclusive with it, not just these nonprofit organizations, not just, the company like the Hartford or something like that, that really does fully embody what it is to have recovery through sport, but the mountains themselves. There's tons of ski resorts around the nation. And yeah, you've got certain past collectives that will offer an adaptive discount. But generally speaking, most of the mountains don't offer that themselves unless you sign up for, say, lessons or passes through their their nonprofit. Here in Aspen, we've got Challenge Aspen, which
Hmm.
is a great nonprofit also. But in order to get those tickets through Challenge Aspen, you've got to sign up through them, and maybe you've got to have a ski instructor one of your 4 days or something like that, which isn't bad. I think it's great to have someone who can teach you some things, but it would be awesome to see all of these mountains say, you know what, we want to make ourselves more inclusive. We're going to offer an adaptive discount, whether that means you come show me your leg, or you get a doctor's note that says, yeah, hey, this guy broke his back, or this gal is in a wheelchair, this person's missing a limb, whatever the case may be. I would love to see all of the mountains create that avenue a little bit more for inclusivity.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point. And you mentioned obviously you skied also when you were younger. So for those that are trying to figure out whether they should ski or snowboard, what suggestions or advice would you give?
That's a good one. I'm always going to lean towards snowboarding, right? Just for the simple fact that I am a snowboarder, and I don't buy into the old concept that you have to learn to ski before you can snowboard. I think there's benefits to both. I mean, my son, he's now 5, and he started on a snowboard because I'm not going to teach him to ski. I can't really ski anymore. I haven't skied since, 1999, the 1900s, as the younger kids are saying these days. But yeah, like,
So last century, right?
yeah. So like, I don't subscribe to that so much. My son was 1.5, and I had already strapped him into a snowboard. He was old enough to and capable enough to stand on his own and walk and stuff like that. So we strapped him in a snowboard and just started pulling him around on flat ground, and then transitioned to the mountains. Sorry, that's him in the background. He gets really excited when he gets to talk about skiing and snowboarding. But he does both now, right? He switched to skiing as well, and he gets lessons through his school. And so he's capable of doing both. And so I don't think there's a right or wrong way here. As long as you're sliding on snow, I come from that era of kind of the tail end of skier versus snowboarder mindset. And my
Right.
generation's done a great job of bridging that gap of skiers can slide with snowboarders and vice versa. And so I always say it doesn't matter if you're backwards on a saucer sled as long as you're having a good time. Well, and not hitting me, but like, I really don't care how people slide on snow. Stand sideways, face downhill, one ski, two skis, a snowboard. It really doesn't matter to me as long as we're having a good time and the stoke is high.
Yeah, that's absolutely
Start
right.
where you're comfortable, I guess would be the advice. If you have any sort of experience, say rollerblading or skating, like roller skating, maybe start with skis. If you've got any sort of experience on a skateboard or surfboard or something like that, maybe start with a snowboard. If you're not sure, try them both.
Mhm.
Try them both.
Yeah, and because I know that I've talked to a few people who find it easier to actually snowboard than ski, just particularly just based on their disability.
Yeah, and that's a great point. Take three tracking for example. Generally speaking, if you're three tracking, you're probably above the knee amputee. I do know some below the knee amputees who three track. uh if you're above the knee, my initial thought is like, okay, you're missing one, a couple joints, and you've only got a couple left to spare. I don't know if I would want to fully rely on that side of my body to do everything. And not to say there's anything wrong with retracking. I'm just thinking like I would prefer to preserve that knee a little bit, that ankle a little bit. And there's some great equipment out there nowadays that can give you that lower extremity back that will not fully replicate what you used to have, but it does a good job of compensating and bridging that gap a little bit.
Yeah. And since you mentioned equipment, I know that equipment it continues to evolve and improve. Um, what do beginning snowboarders need in order to be able to get out on the slopes, equipment wise?
I mean, you can get away with just being in your standard walking leg. In the old days, we would just put a wedge under our heel to kind of lift it up
Yep.
and put us in a nice athletic stance. The problem with walking feet is they're a bit soft and they can become pretty brittle under the amount of pressures that you put on a snowboard. So, say initiating a turn, you're putting a ton of pressure on that foot and it can break. And then on top of that, you start adding really cold temperatures and that type of stuff. The rosins that hold the carbon together can become very brittle. So, there's a great company out there. My teammate Mike Schultz, he owns the company, founder, CEO, all of that of Biodapt. It's Biodapt, Biodapt, and he has the Moto Knee, which he had originally designed for motocross sports, whether it's snowmobiling or dirt biking, and it has some vertical fox shocks, and then it attaches to a foot called the VersaFoot, which in unison it works together.
Mhm.
And for below the knee amputees, we use just the VersaFoot. We attach it to our socket and off we go, And the cool thing about that is it allows enough flex in the ankle to be able to turn the snowboard or skis. But it also, I mean, it's the rear suspension of a mountain bike. So if you're familiar with mountain biking at all, I mean, you can change the air pressure, which changes the stiffness, right? You can change the recoil in the shock so it can kind of snap you back. It absorbs a lot of that chunder. So I mean, if you're looking to just get in it and you don't want to spend the money or can't get it covered by insurance for the VersaFoot, I would say you just go out and try. Wedge the foot, pack out your boot a little bit so that the energy translates to the boot, then to the binding without a ton of lag, because there is space between your pylon and the top of your boot usually that you're waiting for the foot to flex. The leg starts to move forward. It hits the tongue of the boot. We're saying toe side turn here, and then it finally translates. So there is a little bit of a lag, but I mean, there's an array of stuff you can do to kind of speed that up a bit and make it kind of workable if you're not going to move forward with getting some extra equipment.
Yeah. Yeah. And safety wise, what are some things that you recommend in either in terms of equipment or just like particularly when you're getting out and getting started, what are some kind of best practices from a safety perspective?
Oh, always wear a helmet. Always wear a helmet. I mean, your noggin, your brain, that's your most valuable asset on your body, in my opinion. You think about it, appendage wise, you can cut off just about anything. That head is important. That's the captain of the ship, so to speak. So always wear a helmet. If you are going to invest in equipment, just standard equipment, get yourself a good set of outerwear, get yourself some good gloves. I think goggles are one of the most important pieces of equipment for the simple fact that you got to be able to see.
Hmm.
And there's nothing wrong with getting some lessons. If you just don't know where to start, most places have great instructors. Here in Aspen, they've got, I want to say, like 800 instructors or something like that.
Mm.
Talk to your local adaptive programs and see if you can get in on some lessons with them. They have a wealth of knowledge, not only in the skiing and snowboarding industry and fundamentals, but also how to adapt the fundamentals for someone with physical limitations, right? Always keep your eyes up. I always say, obstacles create options, therefore you have opportunities. If you can keep your eyes up so you can see the obstacles, they don't come at you so fast. If you're looking at the nose of your snowboarder 3 or 5 feet in front of you, you're not going to see that tree that you're headed right for, or the other person, or maybe even a ski lift. So one of the most important things you can do is lift your horizon quite a bit, and therefore you can kind of broaden that and use your full fulcrum of ability to kind of move around and look around. So vision up is really important. um yeah, and other than that, have fun. I think that's one of the biggest things too, is we ski and snowboard because it's fun.
Hmm.
I didn't get into skiing and snowboarding because I wanted to be a competitor. That came later. I just love the sport. That's my church. Getting up into the mountains and being 10,000 feet up in nature and figuring out a way to do this dance where it's a cohesive existence, me and the mountain. That is to me the closest that I'll ever get to God, in my opinion. You call it whatever you want, but at the end of the day, go out and have fun, have zero expectations, and just really enjoy the process of learning something new. Because you're gonna slam, it's gonna suck at times, I promise you that. But if you're having fun while you're doing it, it's never that bad.
Yeah, yeah. And obviously, thousands of people go out and ski and snowboard every day for fun. How when does someone know, like for you, when did you know that that I'm good at it and it's something that I do want to kind of compete at? And the second, and the follow-up to that is, then what did you do? What was your next step after you did want to kind of move into the competitive space?
So I think, obviously, like, as as a young man, I had that dream of being a competitive snowboarder. But at some point, that dream had kind of died away. And, I went into an industrial job essentially just to, you know, find a career path. It definitely wasn't until after I lost my leg that I had any sort of inkling that I was good enough. And there was no such thing back then, right? There was no such thing as Paralympic snowboarding. So,
Mhm.
I had felt like I was good. My friends were telling me I was good. And until I was discovered, I didn't really know how good I was. And this thought of, everyone says I'm a pretty good snowboarder, especially for having one leg. Excuse me. But up until that point, I was the only one of my kind that I knew of. And it wasn't until I was discovered that I had any sort of true dreams of it. I had some goals. There was very little, if no, literature on the movement kind of being started right before I was discovered. And so in my head, I was thinking, well, if there's no such thing as Paralympic snowboarding, there's Paralympic skiing, there should be Paralympic snowboarding. So I was actually calling a handful of these organizations that I had mentioned earlier and saying, tell me about Paralympic snowboarding. And like, what are you talking about? There's no such thing. And we can set you up with an instructor. And I'm like, I don't need your instructor. And so my thought was like, if there's no such thing, then we should create it. And so when I got discovered, what I was doing was actually getting some adaptive certifications that day. And this guy was from the NAC doing the certification stuff. And he, at the end of the day, he approached me and he said, so, your colleagues tell me you're missing a limb. I'm like, crap, does this mean I don't get my certification? He's like, no, why aren't you on my snowboard team? And I was like, what snowboard team? And he's like, well, there's an adaptive snowboard pro- program happening and all of this kind of stuff. And I was like, I called that organization 2 years ago and they said there was no such thing. So, I was kind of reluctant to believe him right off the bat, if you will. But essentially he was like, look, I've got an extra spot on my team. The first ever sanctioned World Cup is in a few weeks. Do you want to go? And I was like, sure. He said, well, okay, then meet me in France. And I was like, I don't even have a passport. And he's like, well, figure out how to get a passport and meet me in France and we'll figure it out from there. And that's kind of when I was like, oh, maybe I am good enough. And then that same week, I think maybe it was the following week, I went out to the Utah Olympic Park because they had a little border cross track, and I never raced border cross in my life.
Mm.
And that's when I met Nicole Roundy, Dan Monzo, Ravi Drugan, and a handful of other adaptive athletes that were just like interested like I was. And I guess it wasn't until I went to the competition and kind of got to see myself stack up against other athletes. And granted, I mean, I showed up with baggy clothes, a mohawk, not even on a race board. I was on a free ride board that had been ridden like 200 days on, but I got on the podium and I was like, oh, dang, this is a great feeling. I guess I am good enough. And from that point forward, I was like, we got to make this a thing. We got to push this as hard as we can. We got to try to get in Sochi, and we got to try to just do what we can to help others be a part of this. We need to make this something that's big enough that can be around long after we're gone.
Yeah. And when in the process does someone make those investments in terms of getting their own, well, maybe even as a starter to get their own board versus using maybe a program board, or get their own race board versus using freestyle board?
Sure. So I think, I tell everyone who, I get people that hit me up all the time that say they're coming for me. And I said, well, better bring it, bring your A game if you're going to you know, try to come after me in my spot, I guess. But, what I also tell them is like, hey, really go out there and spend a season doing nothing but snowboarding. And when I say that, I mean minimum 70 days on snow. Get out there for 100, 120 days on snow if you can, because that's what it takes. You really need to find out how your body moves, how it translates to the snowboard, how the snowboard translates to your body. And so if you're at the very beginning stages and it's something you think you want to do or could do, start at the most basic level. Get a loaner board from a program. Do a rental setup. There's a lot of cool demo packages these days that are relatively inexpensive that you can demo a full setup for a day for say 50, $60, maybe 100, I'm not sure. But you can try a lot of different equipment. And you can kind of get an idea of what you like. But I think first and foremost, get something that you can try. And if it's not reacting the way you think it should or something like that, then maybe invest a little bit in something that you can ride and get really used to. I don't promote people getting on race boards right off the bat. I think it's really important to just fall in love with the sport. And I think that's important for skiing as well, is just go out there and fall in love with it and really understand what's happening on the mountain. Get good at it by doing that and enjoy all of that. And then you can start messing around with different stuff. And if and when you are good enough, then you move over to the race boards and stuff like that. That's, to me, it's like taking someone who just got their driver's license, maybe has a year of driving experience, and then throwing them in a Ferrari or, a
Right.
really nice Porsche or something. It's like, you're going to wrap that thing around a telephone pole, because it just does different things.
Right. Yeah. And kind of a similar question or a follow-up question to that is when is it time for someone to maybe even get a coach?
That's great. That's a great question. I think when if we have people who show up to say the Hartford Ski Spectacular, it is the largest adaptive snow sports clinic in the world, just participants wise, plus accessibility wise, right? I think that's a great entry level spot for people to either come out and get their first lessons. I think it's great for those who already know how to ski and snowboard to join up with the race camp and start filling out some of those training techniques. And if they want to go that route, there's a lot of good coaches. I volunteer my time as a coach, as well as a handful of other athletes and coaches. They come out and essentially just volunteer their time for the week to be able to
Mhm.
give this wealth of knowledge to people who may be interested in, say, racing. That's a good place to figure out whether or not it might be for you or not. um, and if it is something for you, then it's time to maybe look into some programs and see if you can get into training program that you can actually have access to coaches. And I think it's incremental steps, though. I wouldn't say, oh, I got my first week on snow, I'm going to go get a coach and become the best in the world. It's like, no, go learn how to snowboard for a year, come back, do the race camp, meet some coaches, see which ones you vibe with, and then go from there.
Yeah, yeah. Because I know a lot of people, I mean, obviously we only have there are mountains in only so many places, right? So I know that there are people who live in mountainless areas, but make the decision to move or locate to a mountain or where there is a program, and that's a big decision to make. Um, what for those that are just kind of um what is the next step once they are getting, at a point where they're coached? Like obviously you have to get classified, you have to go to competitions. And what does the competition landscape look like? Maybe in the interim between beginner race camp and where you are at the international level competing on the world circuit.
Yeah, I mean, if you're to that point where you're like, okay, I'm going to make a full dive into it and start competing, USASA, if you're American anyway, USASA has a lot of great potential for that. It just gives you a lot of opportunity to get into courses and stuff. And depending on your region, you may have more opportunity, you may have a little bit less opportunity, but USASA, it's United States of America Ski and Snowboard Association, something like that. USASA. I mean, if you type it in Google it, you'll find it. That's a great little stepping stone for they do have an adaptive category. Generally speaking, you'd probably be out there competing on your own, but you can also compete with quote unquote our able-bodied counterparts in your age group or something like that. So the courses for USASA and that sort of stuff aren't nearly at the level that say World Cup courses are, right? But it gets you that introduction to what it's like to step into the start gate, what it's like to pull through a course, and I would say that's a great little stepping stone, and there's nothing wrong with doing that at first. I think those courses have a lot to offer
Yeah.
for someone who's just getting their foot in the door on the racing side of things. And, I would also say don't put too much pressure on that. You're feeling it out, right? And if it still continues to be something for you, well, then, that's when you really want to dive deep into what program you're going to train with. And from there, those programs usually have opportunities for, say, start gate training or pump tracks, or maybe even access to a full course. Some of those programs are based out of an area that a USASA race is going to be held. So they're going to have access to a course. And from there, I mean, that's about when you're starting to get eyes set on you anyway. Show up to nationals, because nationals is kind of like, say, the coup de grace of USASA. And that is probably the gnarliest course you're going to see all year, where you can really test your limits. I wouldn't go out and just free ride all year, do one race at a USASA, qualify for nationals because you're the only one in your category, and then show up to nationals. And, you know, there's any number of things that can go wrong. You can either get hurt, or, if some of the big hitters from the country show up, you might get humbled really quickly. uh,
Right.
and I don't mean to say that in any sort of like, there's no intention, but just pure knowledge, right?
Uh-huh.
Um, but I think it's fair to have fair expectations with yourself. But I think that is a good little stepping stone, right? Like you snowboard and you fall in love with the sport. You get linked up with a program that may or may not have ties to USASA and or a course. You get yourself in some courses, you sign up for some races, and you go see what it's actually like. And if you like it, then you pursue nationals. If you do well in nationals, now you're kind of on that path to then going in and getting yourself onto the World Cup circuit. And as you said, you do have to get classified. So, at Ski Spectacular, they do have kind of like a little mock um, classification day
Mhm.
where you can go quote unquote get classified and have an idea of what that process looks like, and whether or not you would be considered for classification. I would just tell everyone not to put too much weight on the results of that, because international classification is a bit different, and it can be a little bit more lax to get people into the sport. So, I know people have done the mock classification there at Ski Spectacular, and they're like, well, they said I couldn't be classified, and then they kind of gave up. And I say, well, that's a silly reason to quit, you know, or go see, the international classifiers. And each sport has different events where you can get classified. So our big classification for snowboarding every year is in the Netherlands. It's an indoor competition. The course isn't super gnarly, but classifiers do show up so that you can get classified. And then from that point forward, you can compete in the continental cups and build enough time on course and points then to qualify for the World Cup. So it is a full process at this point, but it just takes some dedication at the end of the day. And if you are dedicated, you might be right there on the US team standing right next to me someday. I don't know.